Hello. Welcome to Still Separate and Unequal, the Resegregation of America's Public Schools, part of a series of live events presented by the National Center for Youth Law, which is proud to celebrate 50 years of impact in 2021. We are delighted to have today's discussion moderated by our own Shakti Belway, Deputy Director of the National Center for Youth Law. Shakti, welcome. Thank you for moderating today's discussion.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Patty and the National Center for Youth Law for bringing us together today. Also, I am grateful to each of you joining us on this panel for the work that you've done and your participation in this dialogue. The work to achieve integration in our nation's public schools is a decades-long struggle. It is intergenerational. Segregation has a profound impact on our lives, all of our lives, and a lifelong impact that is widely under-recognized. Today, we will engage in dialogue with astounding leaders who have dedicated their time to achieving integration across the lines that separate us, to building human connection and relationships that are built upon the fundamental experience of being human, that which makes us human, that which we all share, rather than being separated by stagnant lines created, defined, and imposed upon us that are used as constructs, social, economic, political constructs to divide. We'll begin now, and I encourage you to open your hearts and minds to our potential and what we might achieve in this great nation. So I'd like to welcome our panelists now and invite each of you to please introduce yourselves, if you would, share how you came to this work to dismantle segregation, and particularly work to desegregate public schools. Annette, would you please begin?
Thank you, Shakti. Yes, hi y'all. My name is Annette. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently the Youth Executive Director of People Operations at the Peer Defense Project at Integrate NYC, and I'm also a senior at college. I started the integration work when I started at Integrate NYC, which was when I was around like a junior in high school. And that's really where I learned a lot of the language that I have now to express my experiences in schools. Because in our prep meeting before this panel, Shakti said something like very powerful that has stuck with me. And it's that like a lot of the times like we don't even like realize how traumatizing the experiences that we go through in school are until after we've had them. And so like for me, learning like that language and starting that work by learning the language from my experiences was really powerful in the space that I found in Integrate NYC, especially because I attended a predominantly white high school. So it wasn't a safe space for me to like really like have my voice in and express my voice. And so a little bit more about how I started in Integrate NYC. I was part of the first leadership council, and a lot of like the main focus of our work was identifying and defining what like integration is for us. And we labeled that as the 5R platform. So that also redefined like what segregation is from the perspective of young people. Because I remember when we first started having these conversations, a lot of the solutions that people would give us and that adults would put in front of us would be about like the movement of bodies and like shifting students from one school to another school. And we just knew from our experiences that it was not just about like moving bodies and making schools look diverse, but it was also about like what was happening inside. And so the 5Rs are like resources, how are resources allocated in each school, admissions, how are students being admitted into schools, restorative justice, how are we restoring the harms that happen in our school in a non-punitive way, and how like do we encourage our young people to learn from their mistakes and not like punish them for it. We have representation because we also want to advocate for a more diverse, teacher representation in staff, and we have relationships, which was the committee that I was part of, which talks about like focuses on all the relationships that happen within the schools. And so how are we building relationships between students, between teacher and students, between like staff and students, and really, yeah, like looking at integration from a perspective, a holistic perspective, and not just like a surface level perspective. And in a way that builds on youth leadership and their development through storytelling. We also do like policy writing at Integrate NYC, and that was part of like how I started the work as well, like how to take my story and put it into policy or like policy recommendations. And right now, to tie it all up, I focused on youth leadership work throughout my 5 years, and as of the last year, I shifted to the legal department called the Peer Defense Project at Integrate NYC, and there we've continued our integration work, looking at it from the legal perspective. So how can we use law as a tool for young people to be able to continue the integration work that they're doing?
Thank you. Professor Orfield, would you please introduce yourself and share how you came to work to dismantle segregation and particularly to desegregate public schools?
Well, it's great to be with you guys and to be a part of an important discussion. I grew up in Minneapolis, which was then one of the whitest parts of the United States. And the first racial issue I really got deeply involved in was in college with Indian populations in Minnesota, which were then the most disadvantaged group in our state. I organized a student volunteer project, got students from many campuses to participate, lived on a reservation, provided services, and we figured we didn't do any harm. We provided a lot of things, but we didn't change anything, but we got to understand the nature of race in a way that was profound and lasting. I went to graduate school in Chicago, and I got deeply involved in Chicago issues of segregation. It was, at that time, the most segregated city in the entire United States. While I was in graduate school, Martin Luther King came to Chicago, ran the Chicago Freedom Movement. And I followed him around the city and listened and learned, did a little volunteer work with his project. But I learned a lot. I decided to write my dissertation on the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act in the South, the transformation of schools in the South. It's called The Reconstruction of Southern Education. It was my first book. That book and other research that I did led me to get involved in actually trying to change things. So since then, I've been involved in more than 30 class action civil rights cases, including some that have gone to the Supreme Court mostly on school integration and access to college. My own children went to school, started school in Washington, D.C. and educated mostly in Chicago public schools and experienced really rich interracial contacts. And we experienced all the complexity of it as minorities in predominantly African Americans and Latino settings. I live in Mexico part of every year, so I'm used to crossing over cultures. And I realized the power of it, the power of exchanging ideas, language, understandings. It has been incredibly frustrating to see that after we learned a lot about this in the civil rights movement, we then forgot it. It was attacked very systematically, starting with the Nixon and Reagan administrations, and ever since by conservatives in the country and the courts that they've reconstructed into a very conservative set of barriers. So we know a lot about the advantages and the complexities of dealing with interracial education and the extreme costs of segregation, which results in the students who need the best schools getting the worst schools and being told that they're inferior because they don't perform as well as the kids who get all the best opportunities. And then told that it would be bad to cross those lines and change anything because it would upset some of the white people in the communities, and that we shouldn't try to do anything. And then have school administrators constantly say, well, they have a solution, but the solutions never work. The solutions are put on paper, but the inequality remains. So I believe that this is an extremely important issue and that we need to pay attention to it, and that it's very late in the game because we're very far through the racial transition of our society and we haven't solved it. We've made it worse in the last generation. We put out reports every year on the level of segregation, the trends in segregation, the alternatives, and usually nobody does anything. Hopefully with the new Congress, which passed a law to help in desegregation efforts in the House of Representatives last year, and the current administration will begin to be able to make a little progress again. But it's been a long time, and people are pretending that segregation can be made equal. But it's always defined from the standpoint of people who don't want to change anything, not from the standpoint of the people who are deeply injured by it.
Thank you. Pastor Bryant, would you please introduce yourself and share your work to dismantle segregation and integrate public schools?
Yeah, I'm Reverend Dr. Eugene Bryant, Sr. I am president of the Lawrence County branch of the NAACP. I'm past president of the Mississippi State Conference of branches of the NAACP. I got involved in the school desegregation because of my daughter in the early 1970s, because Lawrence County school system was segregated. They had 3 or 4 different division of classes, A, B, C, and D, and then they had special education. You can only guess who was at the top of the class in group A. And then they would label Black kids as mentally deficient and put them in special education. The test was flawed and everything else was flawed. So I got involved when they want to put my daughter in special ed, and I would not allow them to do that. Needs to say my daughter graduated at being one at the top of her class. Segregation back then was out in the open because they feared no evil. In 1969, we sued them to get desegregate the classes. We had to turn around and sue them again in 1980s, 85 and 86 for complete desegregation. When we sued them, my name was at the top of the list and my daughter's name. So my family was threatened and I was threatening my life in the state of Mississippi with its racist past, and it's still racist. I've been put in jail and beaten. My life has been threatened. My family has been threatened. I had to have guards at my house when I was gone to a meeting at night. I had bodyguards to guard me when I was at a meeting at night, especially when I was in a public setting with both Black and white. They never knew, some of them didn't even know my name, but they knew of me. They didn't know what I looked like, but they hated me, and some still do. So segregation in the South is an ongoing issue that we fought against for the last 40, 50 years, and it's still alive and well. It has changed somewhat in that it's gone to policies and procedures, it's gone to different kinds of classes, gifted classes, and these kinds of things, but it still exists. We have still schools in the state of Mississippi, and especially in Lawrence County, that are considered Black, some that are considered all white. And these are still the vestiges of past discrimination in the school system. We still have boards that refuse to completely desegregate because they don't want to be seen as giving in to the NAACP or any organization that's about civil rights. So these kinds of things are alive and well, they're ongoing. The battle is not over, the struggle continues, and we must be alive. We must be, as the young people call it, woke in order to understand where we are now.
Thank you. The leadership of each of you is just impactful and appreciated. My work in school desegregation began in Mississippi when I learned things I could hardly believe about like the politicization and of race and how it was used against people and against children and families and communities. And that work continues, and National Center for Youth Law is involved in some cases in beginning to work to advance education equity in Mississippi and beyond. So now we'll move to another question. And if you would, just take a couple of minutes to please define segregation and how it impacts students, families, and communities, and help us understand why this is such an urgent issue today.
Well, from my perspective, segregation is the separation of our children by race and sometimes by social and economic means. Segregation is an idea that was born of the old South and has grown to the new South and is continues to grow. We must at all times be vigilant and trying to dismantle the segregated past. So
I would say segregation is a basic feature of American society from its start. We basically separate and create a hierarchy of racial and ethnic groups. And we historically enforce that with the law, especially in the South, where most African Americans have always lived. But in one way or another, we did it almost every place. Almost every case that's ever been tried in a federal court has shown that it happened on purpose. It didn't happen by accident. It's a vicious and self-perpetuating force because people who have grown up in it believe that it's normal, and that the people at the top of the hierarchy believe that they have the right to exclude others from opportunity, and that any proposed change will be upsetting and dangerous, and they oppose it, one either overtly or tacitly. And it perpetuates itself. It's now spread way into our suburban rings in the country, and nobody's doing very much to stop it. Since 1991, when the Supreme Court authorized the termination of desegregation plans, we've had a major increase in segregation. And it's not just segregation by race and ethnicity, because Latinos are just as segregated as Blacks now. It's segregation also by poverty, both things. People are doubly segregated. It's not just segregated in one dimension. For immigrant students, sometimes it's triple segregation by race and poverty and language. And it does provide unequal opportunities systematically. We've been documenting it for a half a century. And it does, if you do nothing about it, it expands and becomes crystallized into the basic reality of communities. You can't get to equality without taking it on. And people have basically not wanted to take it on, except during the Civil Rights Revolution and immediate aftermath. The court was a big help when we had a court that was positive. We've had a negative court now for almost 40 years as the Republicans, conservatives took over our judicial system. So it means that it's now on individuals, groups, communities, and state governments to take some leadership, and hopefully for the federal government to reawake and do something about it again. But it's a vicious, self-perpetuating force, and it creates, as Martin Luther King talked about, the false assumption of superiority on the parts of those on the privileged side of the line of segregation, and the false assumption of inferiority of the people who are isolated from the best opportunities.
To add on to that, I think the impact of segregation, like we said, exists everywhere, and it's engraved in our daily lives, right? From how we're represented on the media to what curriculum do our young people learn in schools, to like what does transportation look like in your neighborhood, and are there like a lot of trains or like a lot of buses that get to your area, like what grocery stores do you have in your neighborhood, like all of that is a part and is a product, or like the state of it is a product of segregation. And I think it really is impactful, right? Because I feel like there's this false sense of superiority and inferiority because the resources and the funding are not equitable and they're not fair. And so like, what are you telling people about themselves, and like how they should value themselves, and how like powerful they should feel if like the resources and how we're being represented and what we're learning about ourselves is not the same. And it's from the perspective of like Black people and brown people being inferior, because a lot of like the history in our history books is told from a white person's perspective, or like a white man's perspective. And so like that's how we're learning about ourselves, and that's how we're learning about our identity. And that is very impactful to how like we learn to like identify with ourselves, and like the relationship that we form with ourselves and our community. There's this like West African proverb that goes like, it takes a village to raise a child. And so if our community is our village, right, if our school community is our village, if our neighborhood community is our village, then like how are we raising like our children and our young people? And if segregation is like deeply engraved in our systems, in our like how we socialize and stuff like that, then that's how like we're raising it. And I think like we've all come to the understanding that like it's very harmful and it's very violent to be raising ourselves and our young people like that.
Thank you for the very profound analysis and discussion of segregation and its impact on all of us, on young people, on families, and on the communities in which we live. So it has been more than 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education. Yet, clearly, we are still fighting with no end in sight. Will we ever solve this? Is segregation inevitable?
I believe that it can be solved by people sitting down and together with reasoning, but it's going to take the federal government intervening, especially the Department of Justice, in some of these desegregation cases and some of these consent decrees in order to get them to work right. The responsibility of parents and school board members and teachers and educators is they must consider every student that comes through their school, their particular school, as being somebody, and not just discount people because they're Black or brown or yellow. We've got to get back to a course where we educate all of our people in order to have a better impact on the economics and things of this world. And when we don't educate everybody, then they are destined to be at the bottom of the ladder. They're destined to be poor. And then we kind of put them down because they are poor, simply because they were miseducated in the first hand. It can be solved, but it's going to take all of us uniting to push, because seemingly some people feel that the battle has already been won, but it has not. Segregation has taken on a different phase. You have they put people in different places. You have an alternative school. You have different kinds of classes where they put Black and brown kids into. The alternative school, they are full of Black and brown kids. When you do something in class, they will put you aside and they will bring you your lesson and your things that you must do. And this is another form of desegregation. The gifted classes, another form of desegregation. You must maintain a B average or score of this much in order to get in some of those classes. Even at that, we must hire professional people and people with a mindset on humanity rather than race.
Segregation, yes, integration is possible. It was accomplished in a lot of places where it was very hard. Places like where Reverend Bryant is from, where people had their houses fired into, where they lost their
Right.
jobs, where lawyers were driven out of town if they touched these cases. Even in many of those places, very good things happened for a good period of time. And in the South, which is where most desegregation took place, it really never took place in a lot of places in the North and in the suburbs. And it never took place for Latinos in most parts of the country. But in the South, where it was done, some places really remarkable changes took place. I would go into school districts that had never had a Black ever teach a white person. And 2 years later, I'd go in there and the principal would tell me, you know, they love Miss So-and-so. You know, it changed people's attitudes in pretty deep ways. And it certainly wasn't perfect. And it was attacked almost instantly once Richard Nixon got in power. But remarkable things happened. They happened in many places. Right now, if you look at public opinion, most people in the United States realize we're in trouble racially. Most people think we should do something about school segregation. There's actually a big Gallup poll on it in 2019. What most people would like to do is create more magnet schools. Now, magnet schools, where they were done the right way, where they were intentionally integrated and well put together, were a useful tool. Now, many of the magnet schools in the South and elsewhere have become exam schools, and they're excluding people and segregating again. We can't get integration unless we aim for it, and so unless we provide some tools and support to school people who want to do it. It has tremendous advantages for many of the racially changing communities. Unless they can figure out how to integrate, they will resegregate first by race and then by poverty. It's a much better alternative. It's not that hard to do in lots of ways. At the peak of the busing controversy, I went around and visited elementary schools in 10 school districts all over the country, including places like Alabama. All of the teachers told me, you know, these kids don't know what they're supposed to be scared of. They get along pretty naturally. You have to be taught, as the famous musical song went, you've got to be taught before it's too late to hate all the people your relatives hate. You can be taught that kids of other races have the same values, the same concerns, the same hopes that you have. And once you get to know their parents, you find out their parents have the same hopes too. We're not a different country in that way. We're different about fear and separation. When you bring people together, usually they like it. The most intense opposition to the busing that was done in the South was among people who never had any child in any public school. The most favorable attitudes towards it was among the people who actually went to integrated schools. And both whites and blacks said it was a positive experience. So it's not rocket science to do it. We know more or less how to do it. So we've had no leadership and we've had negative pressure from increasingly conservative courts. And our educational leaders have been afraid to take leadership on it. I think if we can get some support from the federal government for voluntary efforts, we can get some serious enforcement from the Justice Department of the old court orders and plans that are already out there. And we can have some serious positive discussion about it. There are many, many things we could do, and we really need to do them before we just build in this segregation in even deeper layers of the very structure of our communities.
Yeah, I don't think segregation is inevitable. I remember when I first started doing this work and having conversations around segregation and integration, someone told me that we should let integration happen organically, as if segregation had also happened organically. But segregation was done very intentionally, politically, institutionally, systematically. And so in that way, integration has to be done the same. And yeah, I think like Professor Orfield said, like people like being together, and like we know that problem solving actually happens better in like diverse groups. And so like we know like the benefits of it, and we know that segregation is like harming all of us. And so to like, will we ever like, you know, like fix segregation or that? I feel like we must, because like that's for the betterment of like all of us. And I think it must be done on like the institutional and political level. And it must also be done on like I see two parts of it, like the self accountability, and then your accountability to community. And so I think a lot of the things that we implement in institutions and in like political systems fall through, because we don't do that deep work of like self accountability and like really healing that like segregation in our communities and in ourselves, because there's a lot of like that have been projected onto us, and how like we have taken on that in our communities as well. And so yeah, I feel like that deep work is also needed in order for this work to be sustainable. We need to heal with ourselves, and we need to heal with like our communities as well.
Thank you. Well, I'll now pose a question that is really quite open in terms of how you might answer it. Okay, so if you would please finish this statement. So I imagine a public school system free from segregation will.
Okay, it says you imagine a system free from segregation.
What would a public school system free from segregation be like?
I think it would be a system that educated every child that came through the door. I think it would be a system that would respond to the community, and there would be community involvement. It would be a system that united the community and united the people that attend that particular school system.
Well, I think it would be a system where we would liberate a lot of the energy we spend enforcing segregation and be able to invest it in a much better way. It would also be, young people in this country know that they're going to be in a society where there is not going to be any majority group, and where we're going to need to understand and work with people of different groups. We have 4 major racial groups in the country now, and we don't understand each other. We have a lot of prejudices and fears. There's a tremendous cost to our society and all of its institutions from those things, because we don't develop the talents of many of our young people, and we don't develop an understanding. What would be different about a well-integrated educational system is that all of the students would learn how to live and work across those lines. It would be natural to cross those lines. When that happens, you have a different society. You have a society where much more of its talent's going to be developed, where there's going to be much energy not wasted in stratifying, and more energy that's created by understanding each other and being enriched by the multiplicity of cultures and traditions we have in our society. They're interesting. It's fascinating. When you live in an actually integrated setting, people love it. People find it weird not to be living in those settings. And I lived in an integrated neighborhood in Chicago for years, and the kids would come home from college and they would look around and they would say, you'd ask them, what was college like? And they'd say, it's so white. They missed the diversity that they were growing up in.
I think for me, a public school system free from segregation embodies the 5R platform that I talked about in the beginning. So we're looking at our young people and actually everyone in that system from a holistic perspective, and not just like about like their role in that place. So not just like as a student or as a teacher, but we're looking at them as a person and addressing those needs. And I think also a system that is adaptable to what young people are saying, like as they come and as they go, like what do young people need from the space, and a system that really can, you know, like address the needs of the people that it's inhabiting, which is like the students in it.
The other thing I'd like to add is it wouldn't be without problems. There's always problems in complicated human institutions. We have to recognize that. Anybody who's a pastor recognizes that about every individual. So we shouldn't expect it to be perfect. It will never be perfect on this world, but it's a lot better than segregation. That's how we should think about it. A lot better, and we can make it better than it is if we work on it.
Thank you. One of the audience, people in the audience shared that it would be a system not confined by neighborhood boundaries. It would instead be based on children's interests and dreams and teach them to thrive. So we have just a short amount of time. If you would each take just maybe a minute, if you have something you might share about what can people do, advocates, parents, community members do right now to dismantle segregation?
Let me say that I hope people will get involved and engaged in the struggle for the future of our children, because right now is the time for us to get engaged. I believe the government responsibility is to know and understand that dismantling of all of these segregation orders and consent decree only mean resegregating some of the school system. When the school system and some of the boards that are presently out there are free to do as they will with no governmental interference, no boundaries that they have to cross, they're going to revert back to their segregated roots and create policies and procedures that will bring the school system back where it used to be. And this is what we must fight against.
Annette?
I think we all bring different things to the table, right? And we all have expertise in different things. So definitely tapping into that expertise and seeing how can you use that as a resource for your community, and specifically like elevating youth power, and like if you are a youth themselves, like how do you create like youth voice? How do you bring like your voice and your power into your community, and start like voicing that and expressing that and making that a part of conversation, because our work cannot stop in like the litigation level, and it can't stop on like the institutional level or political level. It must be like embedded into our communities. So I feel like the most simple like next step that you can take is like start those conversations with like your community, with your family, with yourself. And like start questioning like why don't youth have like more power in the institutions that we hold, especially when it's about like decisions that impact us and decisions that impact like the schools that we're going to. Like why is there mayoral control? Like why don't like young people get to vote on school boards? Why don't we get to like really have like a say in how our schools look and like how we learn and how we interact with each other, and like how can we elevate youth voice in the courts, right? Because right now like law isn't that accessible to communities or to young people. And so how do we make that more accessible to our young people and make sure that as we're building and as we're like addressing segregation and like building for integration, like we are not repeating the same mistakes and repeating the same structures that are already there, but that we're learning from it and creating something that actually serves all of us.
That's a very wise comment.
It is.
I would like to just say that people always feel powerless in the face of these big forces, and they are powerless in the sense that they can't wave a wand and make any big thing change. But all important change starts with a small number of people doing something and getting themselves organizing and challenging others. That's what happened in the civil rights movement, and that's what happens in any big movement. Then it becomes something big. But what individuals can do, for example, is go to their school and their school board and say, what are you doing about this? we've noticed that these schools are systematically unequal. You don't have to go very deep. You just look at the graduation statistics, the college going statistics, and so forth, and you're going to see a dismal picture. Why aren't we doing something about this? I published an article that's coming out next week about what educational leaders can do in the journal called Educational Leadership. Challenge people. Tell them it's their professional responsibility and they should have a plan of some sort. Ask your representatives to support this legislation that's going to move through the House of Representatives to provide assistance to school districts that want to address this. Write letters to the newspaper. Everything matters that you do. And nothing ever changes without people beginning to do things like that and then getting themselves organized. As I said, there's a lot of things you can do that are not rocket science, and actually most people would like to see, like more well-integrated, really good magnet schools. Why not do that? Public schools are losing people because when neighborhoods gentrify, they're not drawing people together because they don't know how to do it. But it can be done, and it's not terribly difficult, but it can't be done unless people have a plan to do it, have some expertise and some support. So there's much that can be done, and individuals are not powerless. And it's really important to challenge people to do what they can do, because if you add up all of those waves, it becomes a tide.
This dialogue is part of that, is connected to that tide. And the work that each one of you has done to move us forward toward more fair and integrated communities is just, your remarkable contribution to, our progress. And thank you for the work that you've done, for your attention and earnestness, and also for, leading this conversation with us and helping connect others to these very, very important issues. And yes, it is. Thank you for inspiring us and telling us that it is in fact solvable and achievable. So thank you, everyone. Patty, we now return to you.
Nice to see you guys.
Thank you, Shakti, and thank you to our wonderful panel. This has been Still Separate and